All right. Um, well, housekeeping stuff before we jump into it today. So that first midterm was last Thursday, kind of a little weird with the holiday. We didn't have class on Friday. I think a couple of you tried to join. I tried to make it, reiterate we didn't have class on Friday. From here on out, the remaining two exams will be on a Friday now, since we don't have any holidays. So what we're going to do is today, modules 5 and 6 will kind of start. So I've combined those two modules into one. The only module reading you have to do is for module 6. So just to make sure, usually these module readings are due before we start class, before we start covering the material. Because it's a little bit weird with a holiday break, and I want to make sure everyone was aware, I don't have the due date on this module reading set to be today. I have it set to be before we start class tomorrow. So we'll kind of do module 5 today, pick up on module 6 tomorrow. We'll probably even start it today. But that module 6 reading is due before we start class tomorrow. I have, under the assignments, I didn't put it on the homepage just to not cause any confusion, and it looks like it has a due date, but module 5 is just there so that at the end of the day, it'll be set to review. You can review the problems within this. This is the module 5 reading. It is not for points, right? It's only module 6 that we have is going to be counting for points, which will be due before you start class tomorrow. We'll start module 7 on Wednesday, so that will that module reading is due before we start class on Wednesday. We'll cover that Wednesday and Thursday. And then after tomorrow's class, I'll have kind of the next module reading pop up as well. Module 8, we'll start that on Friday. So those will be kind of our 3 module readings that we'll have for the week. Module 9 is next week, so that will get posted a little bit later. You can see if you go to, what is it? Nope, it's not what I want. Hold on. I don't want you guys to see that. I need to go to, there we go. The assignments tab, you can kind of see these module readings, 1 and 5 weren't for any points. Here's the ones that are counting for 4% of your grade. Participation quiz, 8%. Weekly quizzes, 18. And that midterm, which was 22. So your grade is currently being calculated based off of that. Obviously, we have 2 more exams that will get kind of added into this, more quizzes. But this is, where you can find all of those assignments and quizzes that are counting towards your grade. Other than that, are there any questions for me? Oh, I also wanted to mention there was a problem. I think it was 24. I put up an announcement yesterday that was graded incorrectly. So I've regraded number 24 so that it has the correct answer being counted as correct. And it updated all those scores. So take a look at your exam score if you haven't, since you took it. That regrade was done yesterday. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we jump into material here today? Everybody hear me okay? Okay, and I'll mention something about today's participation quiz. So for the next 2 exams, we're going to use this built-in, I think I mentioned it, we're going to do it for the exam 1. I was worried that there might be some technical issues, and so we'll kind of hold off and use it just for the remaining 2 exams. I've set the lockdown browser that we'll be using for the exams, so it's being applied to this participation quiz today. So you may not be able to do this kind of live as we're going through it. If you're able to, if your web browser, everything is working correctly, you'll be able to. It'll just lock down your browser. So don't pull this open until we get to it today, just to kind of test it out. Once again, the participation quizzes to kind of give people some flexibility. I've got them set to be the end of the day Sunday. So the participation quizzes that we have for this week will all be due at the end of the day Sunday. So, you can do them early, but you have a little flexibility there. This first one that we're going to use today is going to use this lockdown browser. So once again, don't click on this because it'll lock your browser down if you're watching this kind of live. But this is going to be the first quiz where we try to use that. I want to make sure everyone can get it working correctly so that when it comes exam time, we don't have any issues with it. Okay. All right. So if there's no other questions, we'll jump into material here. Okay. All right. So we are going to go through Module 5 pretty quickly and then use a lot of what Module 5 was talking about to start Module 6. So Module 5 is all about thinking about the surplus of consumers, producers, and allocative efficiency. So we mentioned this term already back in Module 2 when we were thinking about we had production efficient points, but there was only going to be one allocative efficient point. The allocative efficient point was also another word that we were using for the equilibrium. It's where the quantity supplied was equal to the quantity demanded, and the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of consumers and producers were exactly the same. So here it's going to be where the resources, the textbook definition is where the resources being used are producing the highest possible value for society. Or we're going to start calling this economic surplus. So this is not surplus and shortages like we talked about from last exam. This is going to be economic surplus. We'll talk about what that means. Look at it here in a second. So we're going to use the fact that we talked about the demand curve reflects to us consumers' marginal benefits, and the supply curve is reflecting to us the producer's marginal costs. Okay. We said the equilibrium is going to be where supply is equal to demand, or the marginal cost of the last unit is equal to the marginal benefit of the last unit. So this was our equilibrium point. So I'll actually start drawing this for us, and then we'll kind of look at on the slides. But you can think about for consumers, okay, we've got quantity, price. Here was our demand curve. It reflected their marginal benefit. Okay. So if we were to choose any price, all right, so let's say we choose this price here. For every single unit, we can think about, okay, what is the net benefit if you want to think about it that way? So we're talking about economic surplus. You can think about it as like the net benefit. Well, for consumers, their net benefit would be whatever their marginal benefits are minus their marginal costs. What is their marginal benefit? Well, that's reflected by the demand curve. The marginal cost to consumers is going to be whatever the price of the good is. Okay. So we can think about here, this is going to be consumer surplus. So for every unit, you think about for this very first unit, what was the total consumer surplus? Well, here was the marginal benefit of that unit. Here, the price was their marginal cost. You can kind of think about it, this was like the consumer surplus from that first unit. And then we could kind of continue to do the same thing. What about the second unit? Well, here's the marginal benefit. Marginal cost is still the price. So this would be like the consumer surplus of the second unit. We would continue to do that for every single unit up to this point. At that point, the marginal benefit or the demand curve is exactly the same as our marginal cost. We know that this is going to be the quantity, right? Or our equilibrium quantity, where consumers are no longer willing to buy any unit past this point. Why? Because they were indifferent when the marginal benefit was equal to the marginal cost. You can think about here, what was really the consumer surplus at this quantity? It was zero. They're no better off, no worse off. Now, if they continue to go past that point, now my marginal benefits are below that price or below my marginal cost. Here we would have negative consumer surplus. Why would I decrease my net benefits? Or why would I decrease my consumer surplus? I wouldn't. So we see consumers stopping where that price hits the demand curve. All right. So we can kind of think about in general how we're going to draw this out is if I've got my demand curve, because that reflects marginal benefits, wherever that equilibrium price is, my consumer surplus will just be the area below my demand curve and above that price. Why? Because that's representing the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers. Okay. Any questions on this? Let me make sure I have the chat. Okay. We can do a very similar thing, but for producers, right? So for producers, if we're thinking about, okay, here's quantity, here's price. What is producer surplus, or their economic surplus, well, that's going to be the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal costs. This is an equal sign. So we had our supply curve. That told us the producer's marginal costs. What does the price tell us? Well, the price to a producer is their marginal benefit. So really, what we're looking at producer surplus, the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to producers, that's going to be the difference between the price and our supply curve. Okay? So for this very first unit, what was the producer surplus? Well, what is their marginal benefit? That's the price. What's their marginal cost? That's represented by the supply curve. So here, we can kind of think about this area would represent the producer surplus of that first unit. And if we were to look at like a higher unit, right? Marginal benefit, well, it's still the same price. They're selling the good for the same price they were before. But at this higher quantity, the marginal costs are higher. So here's like the producer surplus of the fourth unit. Where do they stop? Once again, where would the marginal benefits be equal to the marginal costs for producers? This point where the price hits the supply curve. Okay, so pretty similar to what we were looking at with consumer surplus. It's just that now, whenever I've got a supply curve, whatever that equilibrium price is, right, whatever they can sell that good for, producer surplus is going to be the area between that price and the producer's marginal cost, or the supply curve. So more generally, here we would have this is going to represent producer surplus. Okay. All right. So with this in mind, we combine the two. We can always think about how do we identify producer and consumer surplus from a market that's in equilibrium. Well, we know we have this upward sloping supply curve representing the marginal cost to producers, downward sloping demand curve representing the marginal benefits to consumers. What is the equilibrium price? It's going to be where supply is equal to demand. So for the entire market, what is total surplus? So if I'm thinking about total economic surplus, that's just going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of that market. Well, what's the marginal benefits of the market? That's represented by the demand curve. Marginal cost in the market represented by the supply curve. Total surplus is going to be the area in between our supply and demand curve. It's made up of two things, right? We said down here, this part of total surplus, right? That was producer surplus. I generally write that as PS to kind of shorthand it. And then what was this part of total surplus? Well, that was coming from our consumers. So a less technical way of remembering this, consumer surplus is always on top, producer surplus is always on bottom. To get total surplus, we would add those two together, or just look for the difference between our supply and demand curve. And the allocative efficient point, that price, that equilibrium price, notice that's where the marginal benefit of the last unit, our equilibrium quantity, is equal to our marginal cost. Okay. Any questions on that before we hop back to the slides here? Okay. Well, I can leave this here while we hop back. People are still writing. All right, so went through this pretty quick, right? Total surplus, we kind of already talked about this for consumers, the area between the price and the demand curve, right? Or we can think about for every quantity, for every unit, we're adding up the difference between that unit's marginal benefit and the price. We add all those up, that would be this entire blue shaded area. Excuse me. And then once again, less technical, area below demand, above the equilibrium price. So how would I calculate this with some actual values? Well, let's say I had the equilibrium price here of 40. How would I find total consumer surplus from every single unit? Will just be the area of this triangle. How do I find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times the height. So goes from 100 to 40, so 60. Goes from 0 to a quantity of 50. So 50 times 60 times 1/2. So we have total consumer surplus of $1,500 here. Right? It shouldn't be too crazy, right? We're just dealing with linear curves, always linear curves. So it's just the area of a triangle. And then same thing for producer surplus. We said that's going to be for every single unit, the difference between the marginal benefits to producers, which is the price, and their marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So it's that area below the equilibrium price, but above our supply curve. How would we calculate that? Well, if I had a supply curve and the equilibrium price was 70 here, once again, it's the area of a triangle. So 1/2 times the base. So the base goes what, from 0 to 50. Height, it goes from 20 to 70. So 50 times 1/2. So in this example, right, our producer surplus is going to be a little bit lower, right, than our consumer surplus. So 1250. Okay. Any questions? I'm going through this quick, but I kind of already set us up for this pretty well, I think. So, we think about consumer surplus. I paid 3,000, but I would have paid up to 4,000. So there's going to be some units when we're thinking about consumer surplus where for this 10th unit, the price is only 40. I would have paid almost what, 85 or something like that, right? So for all of these units, the consumers would have been willing to pay more than what the current equilibrium price is. So you can kind of think about for every unit here, the consumer was gaining, right? They would have paid more money than they actually did. So they were having like a net benefit. And then for producers, right? They, received a certain amount of money, 3,000, but they would have done it for much less, right? So that would be kind of their producer surplus. Here, for these units right here, they would have supplied them to the market at what, 40, 45, 50, and they were getting $70 when they sold them. So for all of these units, producers were kind of having some additional net benefits or producer surplus, okay? So that's basically module 5. This is why I combined them. I think module 5 could be, and 6 could probably be combined. I like the text though, so this is why we're using it. But if I rewrote it, I might combine those two. Okay. Any questions before we then kind of start to use these ideas and look at some module 6 stuff? So are we going to be able to access slides after class is over? Oh, well, I'm glad someone said something. They should be up there. So these skeleton slides, you're not able to access them. I've got the complete slides and I post those after we go through them. It just has some stuff for me that I think is better for your learning to see me kind of walk through some animations, things like that. But it should allow you to pull these open. Is anybody else having difficulty accessing these skeleton slides? Why would they be locked? Because it looks like they're published. Let me make sure. So that's published. That's published. Is it because this is not? All right. Yeah, if you ever can't, thank you for saying something. Let's try that. See if that unlocked them. Okay, thank you. So now you should be able to kind of go through this. Now, we didn't use them too much. I did a lot of the work on the dot cam, so hopefully that was adequate there. And then, yeah, I'll make this one available after tomorrow's class once we kind of complete all the material. Yep. All right. So once this is like a see something, say something, right? Thank you. So the next thing we're going to talk about are government policies that impact this consumer and producer surplus. So a couple of things we'll talk about are price floors and ceilings, quotas. So the government sometimes, I think, prior to the exam, I kind of alluded to this idea of the government can come in and say you can only charge this price per specific good. So we'll be a little more specific in how we talk about those actions with price ceilings and price floors. We'll also talk about instead of setting prices, they can set quantity or quotas. Okay. We're then also going to talk about taxes and subsidies. This will be more next class, but you're adding cost or you're adding benefits. I once again already alluded to this a little bit in previous chapters, but we're going to say, how do all of these impact our allocative efficient point? And what do they do to consumer, producer, and I didn't add it in here, but also total surplus. Okay. So long story short, right? And we'll see how we get there, but all of these government actions, if they change the equilibrium, if they move the market away from the equilibrium point, they're going to create something we call deadweight loss. So in our previous depiction of these markets, I was thinking about, we had supply, demand. When a market is in equilibrium, we would say that total surplus is maximized, right? So when we're thinking about consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve, but above the equilibrium price. And then we had producer surplus, the area below price, but above the supply curve. Total surplus was just the sum of those two. Total surplus is maximized when a market is in equilibrium. So the first thing that we'll talk about, and we'll kind of go back to the slides to look at this, but I'll set us up since we're already here, is what if the government comes in and sets what we call a price ceiling? Okay. So a price ceiling says you can't charge a price above a certain amount. All right, so I'll try to draw these side by side so we can kind of do a comparison here. All right. So here's our supply curve, and I'm going to try to draw these kind of to scale. So we've got, here was our old equilibrium price and quantity, right? We can kind of see where consumer and producer surplus was. If the government comes in, so let's say this price was, I don't know, 50. If the government comes in and says, all right, we're going to impose a price ceiling. Okay? This means you can't charge a price above this amount. Okay? So the market wants to get to this price of 50, but the government comes in and says, you can only charge, the highest price you can charge is 40. Right? So what does this look like? Something like rent control, right? You can't charge rent above a certain amount in certain areas, right? There's a law against it. So what's going to happen? Well, we can't get to that equilibrium point. In fact, for every unit here, what is now true about the marginal costs and the marginal benefits to producers? Well, for producers, right, their producer surplus is the difference between marginal benefits and the marginal costs. The marginal benefit is the price. The marginal cost is represented by their supply curve. For every unit here, the price is now below the supply curve. So they're no longer willing to produce or sell any of these units on the market anymore. The last unit that they'd be willing to supply at this lower price of 40, so we'll call this like, this is the quantity after the price ceiling. Okay. Well, if this is the quantity after the price ceiling, what is producer surplus? Well, it's the difference between this new price and the supply curve. So hopefully we can kind of see, oh yeah, with this price ceiling, what's happened to producer surplus? We lost all of this, right? Now, for consumers, right, we can think about, well, is a lower price a good or a bad thing? Well, for consumers, that's a good thing, right? For the producers, it was a bad thing, and lo and behold, it led to lower producer surplus. But for consumers, we said their surplus, the difference between their marginal benefits and costs, that's the difference between the price and the demand curve. Well, now notice the price is now down here at 40. So for every unit that we see produced and sold on the market, consumer surplus is going to be right here. So they lost a little bit, but they gained a bunch of surplus here. We had a transfer of surplus, economic surplus, from producers to consumers. Now, what was also created relative to when the market was in equilibrium, okay, all of these units are no longer sold on the market or produced, so they can't be purchased, they can't be consumed. Every unit here, that difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs, we lost all of that surplus, or what we end up calling our deadweight loss. Okay. Needed a different color, and that marker wasn't quite as thick, but hopefully here. Deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on this before we jump back to the slides here? Okay. All right. So just another way of visualizing this. So usually we see these, I always say rent controls because it's probably the most common one. Also during times of war, we'll see like raw materials like steel or aluminum or, I'm guessing now, I don't know, uranium or something. They might put a price ceiling if we need that for war, right? So just another depiction of this. This is a rent control example. So we've got the quantity of apartments and we've got monthly rent, okay? So before the rent control, right, here is our equilibrium. Consumer surplus, the triangle on top, or the area between the equilibrium price and the demand curve. Producer surplus, triangle on the bottom, area in between the price and the supply curve. Total surplus would be the sum of those two, or the difference between our supply and demand curve. Let's say the government comes in and sets a price ceiling, right? And says you can't charge $1,000 for rent anymore, only $800. Well, producers stop supplying apartments to this market now, not out at 2 million, but 1.8 million. So here, what's the new price? The new price is this 800. So producer surplus is going to be only this little area. Consumer surplus, we said, is the area between the price and the demand curve, but only up to that new quantity after the price ceiling. So here is our total consumer surplus. This purplish area, it is now consumer surplus, and it used to be producer surplus. So price ceilings transfer, right? They lower the price. They take some of what used to be producer surplus and turn it into consumer surplus. But then every apartment here from 1.82 million is no longer being supplied to the market, so no one can buy it. That would represent our surplus that we lost from before the rent control. That would be our deadweight loss. Okay. And then what is total surplus? Well, here's consumer surplus, here's producers. We would just add those two together. So total surplus is decreased, consumer surpluses went up, producer surpluses went down. And then we now have deadweight loss. Right? Any questions before we keep moving here? And I'll draw something for the next slide, but since we're in the slides here. Now we can have, everything I've talked about to this point is technically what we would call an effective price ceiling. Okay? So an effective price ceiling is going to be set below whatever the current equilibrium price is. So it lowers the price, causes the quantity to also, right, go from 2 to 1.8 million. So quantity goes down. Right? Excuse me. I'll show you in a second. It causes shortages in the number of units. It wastes resources. It can also cause black markets. Ineffective price ceilings, right, is if you set it above the equilibrium price. And what change is that going to have? It's actually going to do nothing. So we'll kind of look at this visually here now. And I'll point out how an effective price ceiling can cause a shortage. I'll talk a little bit about black markets, and then we'll kind of look at ineffective price ceilings as well. Okay. So stop share there. Make sure I've got this. Yeah. All right. So we'll talk about ineffective price ceilings first. So let's say I've got a market, supply, demand, current equilibrium prices. I'm just going to choose 50. Okay. If the government comes in and says, you can't charge a price, right? Here's our price ceiling. Anything above $60. So they set the price ceiling above the current equilibrium. So think about like a ceiling. You can't go any higher. So when I put a price ceiling, I'm saying all of these prices are now off limits. Well, the problem is if the current equilibrium price is 50 and I tell you you can't sell it for more than 60, are you? No. You look at me and say, okay, I'm not. Nothing changes, right? So anytime you have a price ceiling set above that equilibrium price, this would be ineffective. The only way this price ceiling is what we would say binding is if we come in and set it somewhere below that current equilibrium price, right? Anytime I set a price ceiling below that, well, now if I was charging 50, the government now says I can't charge any more than 40. Well, now I have to change right? I was, so I have to change my actions. Okay. So ineffective price ceilings is if I ever set it above. What happens there? Nothing. The market stays in equilibrium. Total surplus is still maximized. We would have absolutely no deadweight loss. But if they set a price ceiling below the current equilibrium, that's where we had some deadweight loss. We saw a reduction in quantity. And I said causes a shortage and then also black markets. So just in case people are kind of, there we go. I'll leave this on here. Let's think about if we do have an effective price down here. Right? So whatever the old equilibrium price was, if the government comes in and sets an effective price ceiling, we know the new quantity that we see in the market is going to be down here. So notice at this lower price, what will always be true? Well, we're always going to be below the old equilibrium point. The quantity supplied at this price is less than our quantity demanded. So if the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, we have a shortage. So it creates a shortage as well as, well, we also said there's now some deadweight loss here, right? A loss of surplus. So what's interesting here is that, let's say we use the rent control example. So they've lowered rent. People before, this is how many people were renting apartments. Those people still want a place to live, right? No one's willing to supply those at this new lower price, but there's plenty of consumers who would be willing to pay prices higher than the current price ceiling, but no one's willing to supply them. So if they can't legally supply them because they can't charge a price higher than this, what might the producers do? Well, maybe I kind of go, circumvent the laws and start renting this without reporting it. Well, how much are these consumers willing to pay? What's their marginal benefit? Well, up here, so instead of charging this price ceiling, another market will be created, we will call a black market, in which there's going to be some market power dynamics that we won't talk about till future modules, but those producers can get away with charging these people exactly what their marginal benefit is. If they're doing it kind of illegally, they're not constrained by this price ceiling. And we'll still see this many apartments sold and rented, but consumers are going to be charged exactly what their marginal benefit is. So for all of these consumers, anyone in this range, their consumer surplus would go to zero. This would actually benefit any of the producers that existed in that black market. Okay. I won't ask you questions related to the black market, just knowing that because we've restricted quantity, if this good is still sold illegally, there are still people willing to supply it in this range, and there's still people who are willing to buy it. It might just be that they're having to do it illegally. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. So where are we at on time? Oh, got plenty of time. Good. So, oh, lost my mouse. Where did it go? There it is. So another way of looking at this, we've already talked about, probably reiterating this, but I'm really trying to hammer this idea home. So let's go up here, get this out of the way. So here's our old equilibrium price and quantity, just a different way of thinking about what we call welfare effects or the changes in economic surplus. So before, area A, B, and E was all representing what? The area below demand, but above price. So that's the consumer's marginal benefit is the demand curve. Price is their marginal cost. So this would be consumer surplus. Areas C, F, and D, well, it's the area below the price that they're charging, but above their supply curve or their marginal costs. So this would represent producer surplus. Okay. After an effective price ceiling or a binding price ceiling, right, it's actually going to have an impact in the market. We said the new quantity will be here. We said, okay, at that lower price, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. We're going to have a shortage. Okay. Consumer surplus, well, we only go up to whatever the last unit supplied to the market is now, because no one's supplying these. So consumer surplus, the area above this new lower price, but below their demand curve, is now no longer A, B, and E. It's A, B, and C. So they lost this area E over here, but they gained area C. So it might be, I try to make this to scale that you can see generally for consumers, that loss is going to be much smaller than their gain, and so they're going to be better off, right? So we have some examples, I think, in the quiz. We use some actual numbers. We'll see that when we calculate these, consumer surplus after a price ceiling will go up. And that's intuitive in that, okay, if I'm lowering the price, who is that going to benefit? Consumers. Who does it hurt? Producers. Notice after this price ceiling, what is producer surplus? Well, the area below the new price, but above the supply curve, is only going to be area D. Before, it was D, C, and F. So producers lost a lot of surplus here. Excuse me. Part of that loss went to consumers, right? So they're left with this. They also lost this little area here. So area E and F, E is the consumer surplus that was lost because of the price ceiling. F is the producer surplus lost because of this price ceiling. This is going to be surplus the market no longer gets, right? The quantity stops here. So E and F would represent our deadweight loss. Okay. So we can think about, some actual values to this, right? So blue is going to be our consumer surplus. Green, producer. That red area was our deadweight loss. So how do I calculate my consumer surplus before? Well, that was just the entire triangle here, right? Consumer surplus would have been wherever that equilibrium price was. So what? The height is 40, base is 40, so 40 times a half, 800. After the price ceiling, well, now the new price is only 40. The quantity is at 30, so I would have to find the area of a rectangle and a triangle. So what? This triangle would be 30 times 30 times a half, plus the area of a rectangle, 20 times 30, no times a half, because it's not a triangle, right? So 20 times 30 plus 30 times 30 times a half. We can see here, consumer surplus after a price ceiling will actually increase. Okay. Now, what about producer surplus? Okay. Well, with producer surplus, before it was the area below that equilibrium price. So what? The height is 40, base is 40, so 40 times a half. I have an example here where initially consumer and producer surplus started out exactly the same. After this price ceiling, what is producer surplus? Well, now it's just going to be the area below the price above the supply curve. So what? 30 times a half. It's fallen to 450. Okay. So what is total surplus? Well, before it was what? 800 plus 800, producer plus consumer surplus is our total economic surplus. So 1600. What is it after the price ceiling? 1050 plus 450 is only 1500. So what is deadweight loss? Well, deadweight loss is the loss of surplus. We just said we went from 1600 to 1500. So our deadweight loss should be $100, right? How would we actually calculate that though? Well, we could take the difference between the total surplus before and after, or we know that this little red area represents the units that are no longer being produced and sold on the market. So we're no longer getting any of this surplus. The difference between our supply and demand curve here, little triangle, so 20 times 10 times a half, would give us that same value of 100. Okay. So kind of notice here, the producers and consumers, each of these triangles would be 50. So consumers lost 50. However, they gained this rectangle, which would be what, 10 times 30. So they gained 300. So they really gained $250. Sure enough, that's the difference between consumer surplus before and after. And then producers, they lost that 50. They also lost 300. So they went from 800 minus 350. Sure enough, it's that consumer or producer surplus after the price ceiling of 450. Okay. Any questions on that? Make sure there's nothing in the chat here. Okay. So timing wise, I think we're good. So let's try to get through price floors today. So price floors are going to be basically very similar to price ceilings, but everything is going to be reverse, right? Flipped. So a price ceiling says you can't charge a price above this. Price floor says you can't charge a price below this amount, okay? So examples, we have minimum wages. To be an effective price floor, if price ceilings to be effective had to be set below the equilibrium price, an effective price floor needs to be set above it, right? So if I'm currently charging $50 for something and you tell me you can't charge any less than 40, what would I say? Okay, I'm not, nothing changes. But if you tell me you can't charge a price less than 60, well, I am, things are going to have to change. So unlike a price ceiling, it's not going to cause a shortage. It'll actually cause a surplus in the number of units, right? And then it's also going to create some dead weight loss, just like we talked about before. If it's ineffective, nothing happens, right? So, I accidentally scrolled. So kind of similar to our price ceiling. If I'm thinking about a price floor, got my supply curve, got my demand curve. Here was my old equilibrium price. Anytime I have a price floor set below the equilibrium, well, if you currently are charging 50, you tell me I can't charge a price below 40. Think of like a floor means you can't go any lower. Well, I'm not charging a price below that. So this is going to be the range of ineffective price floors. Okay. If they came in and said instead, all right, you can't charge a price any lower than 60. Okay, well, I currently am. So anything that's set above that equilibrium price, this would be our effective price floor. Okay. So what's going to happen with these effective price floors? Well, I'm kind of killing my marker here, so let's switch. So if I have an effective price floor, got supply, got demand, right? So let's say they come in and set an effective price floor. Okay. Well, what's going to happen? Okay. For every unit past this point now, if I'm thinking about consumers, they're only going to buy something if that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, right? What was their marginal benefit? The demand curve, price is their marginal cost. So for every unit here, the marginal benefit is now below the price. So they're no longer going, yeah, plenty of people would be willing to supply it at this higher prices, right? But nobody wants to buy it. So with this price ceiling, the new quantity will be down here. So instead of the producers dictating what the quantity is going to be, it's now the consumers. So quantity demanded is now going to set our new quantity after the price ceiling. At this higher price, yeah, people would be willing to supply more, but no one's willing to buy it. So now we've kind of created a surplus in terms of the number of units. Okay. Where is producer consumer surplus going to be? Well, we said for consumers, it's the area below the demand curve, but above this new price. So I think I was keeping it blue on the other one. So here's new consumer surplus. Well, what did it used to be? Was the area above the equilibrium price. It used to be a much larger area. Where's producer surplus now? Well, it's the area, where do I have room here? There we go. Difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost of producers. Their marginal benefits, the price. So this is going to be the new price after the price floor. And I put PC here, sorry. We're not doing ceilings, we're doing floors. And then the marginal cost represented by their supply curve. So for every unit up to that last unit that someone's willing to buy, producer surplus would be that difference between the new price and the supply curve. So it used to be kind of this rectangle, or sorry, triangle. Now it's kind of this triangle and rectangle. So similar to when we had price ceilings, if I caused there to be a lower price that benefited consumers, hurt producers. If I cause the price to be higher, and this is where it's kind of not quite intuitive because like a price floor actually increases the price ceiling actually decreased it. Well, now if there's a higher price, that's going to benefit producers, hurt consumers. And then all of these units that were being sold at the old equilibrium no longer are. So all of this would represent our deadweight loss. Okay. So here's a price floor. Looks kind of similar to a price ceiling, but everything gets flipped, right? Price floors hurt consumers, benefit producers. So we'll have the same visual that I had before, but now we'll think about for price floors. Okay. So here's our old equilibrium price and quantity. If we had an effective, we didn't have any price ceiling or any price floor, consumer surplus, area below demand above price, A, B, and E. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, area below price above the supply curve, C, D, and F. Total surplus would be that entire area. Okay. Questions before we keep moving here? So if I have an effective price floor, and I don't allow the price to go any lower than this, we said we're going to have now the quantity demanded at that higher price is below the quantity supplied. So we have a surplus in terms of the number of units. The new consumer surplus would only be the area above this new price after the price floor below the demand curve. So area A. So we went from having A, B, and E to only area A for consumers. So they lost this area and this area. Now for producers, their surplus will be the area below the price, but above the supply curve. C and D, that was part of their surplus before. They've now gained this area B from consumers, and they lost a little bit of surplus over here. Generally, this loss of surplus will be much less than the gain that they have here. So what does this area over here represent? This was the consumer and producer surplus lost because we're no longer getting to that equilibrium quantity. So all of these units are no longer being produced and consumed in the market. This would be our deadweight loss. Okay. So just another way of looking at this visually, trying to relate it to what we did before. We can also put some values, some numbers to it. So let's say I have an example where the old equilibrium price was what? 50 and 40 was the number of units. So consumer surplus would have been the area above 50, but below the demand curve. So that triangle would be what? 40 times 40 times a half. Oh, I think these are the exact same values we had before. With a price floor, though, consumer surplus after the price floor is now just this blue triangle, the area above the new price, but below the demand curve. So 30 times a half. With this price floor, now we see consumer surplus. We've raised the price. Consumer surplus is going down. What about producers? Well, once again, before, the area below price above the supply curve, that triangle would have been 40 times 40 times a half. So we started out with that same 1,600 total surplus. After this price floor, we've got the area of a rectangle. So what, 20 times 30 plus the area of this triangle, 30 times 30 times a half. Now we see producer surplus after this price floor has now went up. And then what did we lose? Once again, we could calculate the area of this triangle, 20 times 10 times a half, or just take the difference between, well, what was total surplus before? 1,600. What was total surplus after? 1,500. That deadweight loss, we lost $100 of total economic surplus. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So this is just kind of a slide to kind of put these on the same thing. An effective or binding price floor has to be set above the current equilibrium price. So once again, it's kind of weird because it's like a price floor. But remember, floor means you can't go any lower. So the only way that it's effective is if the old equilibrium price is below it. Right? So effective price floors have to be set above the old equilibrium. And then effective or binding price ceilings have to be set below it. Okay. Let me think about this. We'll come back to this if we have time. If not, it'll be a good way to start next class. So let me see. So let's jump into this. So it should only lock your browser down while you're in the quiz. So I don't know, we've got a little bit of time here. Anybody wants to humor me and try to start that quiz and let me know how it goes getting into it here. So first someone gets into it, please let me know, and then we'll kind of work through these problems. Is it a little bit slower opening for anybody? Anybody want to humor me? Anybody trying to get into it or no?
I'm not sure if this is just my end, but when I
Yep.
click on like trying to do it, it just
Yep.
says no preview available. I don't know if it's not published or something like that.
Well, should be. Let's go back and make sure. Yeah, this is probably why. I forget that it gets goofy like that. Let's try this again. So now this one should be, let's see if that, let's try it now. Let me see, because it's published here, here. It's now with the other quizzes. So let's see if it's now available. Did that fix it or no?
Yeah, it's letting me open it now. It's just
Okay.
updating lockdown browser. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So we'll kind of start working through these problems. Hopefully you're able to kind of get this pulled up. If you have any issues with the lockdown, we can kind of talk through it after we go through the questions. This really is about as far as I want to get today. Like I said, if we have a little extra time, I'll still go through some of that minimum wage stuff. It's just looking at what we're talking about in a different context. So once you're able to hopefully get that quiz pulled open, you should see, I think I've got 4 questions here. Yeah, so we've got 4 different questions. Right? So the first one, and I think it's all using the same kind of graph. So let's say that I had this market and I currently put a price ceiling of $30. What's going to happen to consumer surplus after this price ceiling? Well, if the price ceiling is at 30, first question we have to ask is that effective or not? Well, if it's a price ceiling that says you can't charge a price any higher than 30, well, I previously was, but the old equilibrium was 50, so that is going to be effective. at this new price of 30, no producer is going to want to supply any unit past 20 because their marginal costs are now above their marginal benefits, right? The marginal benefit to the producer is the price. So the quantity stops at 20. Consumer surplus is the area underneath our demand curve, but above that price. It's difficult to run lockdown browser Zoom. Oh, because you guys have Zoom pulled open as well. Gotcha. So this might not work for us to kind of do it together. Okay. So instead of running this alongside of me, and I want you guys to have multiple, well, I'll create another participation quiz where, well, how do I want to do this? Because those of you who are here, I want you to be able to work through it now. So those of you who are here, don't worry about this one. I'll create a duplicate of this. You'll have the answers after we work through them. It'll still require a lockdown browser, so I'll replace this quiz essentially after class with, it'll look like the exact same thing. But that way, if you started it and had to exit out now, it won't count against you. So you'll just have to get on right after, or later on today, and kind of fill out this quiz and make sure that lockdown browser works. Is that clear what I'm saying there? So don't worry about this current version. I'll post one up as soon as I'm done with class and I get back to my office. It'll be the exact same quiz. It'll just be a way where you can kind of make sure that this lockdown browser is working and you can kind of get your scores. Okay, get your scores into the gradebook. Sorry. So, but I will, you'll have the answers after we work through these. Okay. I didn't think about you having to have Zoom open while we were doing this. That is, yeah, absent-minded professor. What a trope, right? So, we're at this new quantity of 20. We said, what is consumer surplus? The area below the demand curve, but above the price. So we have the area of this triangle and the area of this rectangle. So what? 40 times 20, so that's 800. And then 20 times 20 times a half. So that would be 200. So we would have what? Consumer surplus there being 1,000. Okay. And then here, instead of a multiple choice, we can have drop downs, but we can kind of think about what's going to happen if we have a price ceiling of 30. What will happen to producer surplus and what's going to happen to deadweight loss? Well, anytime you have an effective price ceiling or an effective price floor, you know you're going to have deadweight loss, right? The new quantity is down at 20 instead of the old quantity of 40. So every unit in that range, we lost out on the surplus, or the area in between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs of the market. We lost this entire area. So if I asked you to calculate the value of deadweight loss, it would be what? The area of this triangle, so 40 times 20 times a half, so 400. Here I just asked you what happens. Well, if you have an effective price ceiling, deadweight loss goes from 0 without the ceiling to something, so it's going to increase, right? And in fact, we could actually calculate the value if we wanted to. Now, producer surplus, this is, once again, I'm not asking you to calculate the value, so this should actually make a question like this easier. Now, you can think about, you could calculate what was producer surplus before. So it would be the area below that old equilibrium price and above the supply curve. So 40 times 40 times a half. So that's what, 800? It's now what, 20 times 20 times a half? So it's going to be, what, 200? It's fallen a lot. But intuitively, a price ceiling is doing what? It's lowering the price. Who's that going to benefit? Consumers. Who's that going to hurt? Producers. That's why we see when we do the actual calculation, producer surplus has decreased. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. Now, what if I put a price floor at 70, right? What would the value of deadweight loss be here? So I didn't put as many like dashed lines, so it would make it a little bit more difficult. But if the price is 70, and that's a price floor, say I can't charge a price below that. Okay, well, I previously was, this is going to be effective or binding. Nobody past that quantity of 20 every unit now, the marginal benefit is below this new price or the marginal cost to consumers, so they're not going to be willing to buy any of these. So we are going from that equilibrium quantity of 40 to our new equilibrium quantity after the price floor. It's not really an equilibrium quantity, but it's the quantity after the price floor of 20. Every unit in that range, we lost out on the area in between our supply and demand curve, or the marginal benefit and marginal cost of all those units. So here we've got the area of this triangle. So it goes from 70 to 30, so 40 times what's the base? 20 to 40, so 20. 40 times 20 times a half. Our deadweight loss should be 400 there. Okay. Any questions on that? What do I have down here? Okay. Just some things I want to mention that aren't in the quantity. What did this price floor create? At this higher price, the quantity demanded was less than the quantity supplied. So there we would have a surplus in the number of units. What did the price ceiling do? Well, there the quantity supplied was less than our quantity demanded. So our price ceiling caused a shortage in the number of units. Okay. Those are other kinds of questions I could ask you, maybe from these graphs. Now here's one where if this was on a quiz or an exam, a little tricky. So let's say I'm still looking at a price floor. If I set a price floor at 30, what's going to happen to producer surplus and deadweight loss? So you might be like, oh, okay, the new quantity is going to be down here. Producer surplus is going to be this small triangle. Here's deadweight loss. I'm losing all this surplus. But remember, if it's a price floor, that means I'm telling people in that market, you can't charge a price below this. What was the equilibrium price? 50? Is that below 30? No. So what happens in this market? Absolutely nothing. Producer surplus would stay the same. Deadweight loss, what was 0 before, it's going to be 0 again. So those would both kind of remain the same, right? No deadweight loss. Producer surplus, if we actually wanted to calculate it with an ineffective price floor, it would just be whatever producer surplus was before. I think 40 times a half, so 800. So always kind of, if we're looking at price ceilings or price floors, the first thing we always need to check, is it effective? Now you might say, well, why would the government set ineffective price floors or ceilings? Well, they might not, right? So I'll use the minimum wage as an example here in a second, but just talking through the logic, maybe the current equilibrium wage is $10, right? And then they come in and say you can't charge, minimum wage needs to be, I don't know, can't be any less than $8. Okay, that's not binding, but then things could shift the supplier demand curve, lowering the equilibrium wage to $7, and now it's an effective or a binding minimum wage again. So, because there's time lags, maybe when they set the minimum wage originally, maybe it was binding, things shifted, then it wasn't, or vice versa. All right. Any questions over the quiz questions? If not, I have one more thing that I want us to be able to work through, and then I might give you examples of on quizzes or exam. Okay? All right. So let's think through. So this is our typical kind of market, right? We had quantity, price, we had supply, demand, right? If I'm thinking about the quantity of labor instead, and I want to look at the demand and supply of labor, what does this price become? Well, the price of labor is someone's wage, right? Now you can think of this as an hourly wage. If it helps us initially, we'll think about like a market for labor that was just hourly workers. So maybe something like, I don't know. I was just at the grocery store the other day. So maybe to be a cashier or stock person, all these jobs that require kind of thinking about lower levels of labor, unskilled labor, we would call it in economics, and you're thinking about the hourly wage. Okay. So here would be that initial equilibrium price, which is just the equilibrium wage, right? And here was our initial kind of equilibrium quantity of labor. Okay. So this really would represent like the number of workers. So what is a minimum wage? A minimum wage, if it's effective, right? We'd say, well, this wage is too low. We want people to make more money. So what would a minimum wage have to be if it's effective? I would say, look, you can't charge a price or you can't set a wage below this amount. So if it's an effective minimum wage, that means that whatever the current price being paid to people are, I set it somewhere above that. So essentially, what is a minimum wage? It doesn't allow that price to be below it, or it doesn't allow the wage to be below it. It's just a different example of a price floor. Okay. So if we have this minimum wage, it's an effective minimum wage, it's going to be an effective price floor. So what did that do, right? Well, we said if I'm increasing the wage, right, who is that going to benefit? Well, at this new point, what's my producer surplus and what's my consumer surplus? Right? So this is where it gets a little bit weird. Who's the consumers of labor? This is actually going to be companies. So the labor market's weird because generally we think about ourselves as the consumers. We're buying things. We're typically the consumers for products. When it comes to labor, who's the consumer of labor? This is going to be companies, right? And then who are the producers of labor? Well, those are the workers. That's you and me, right? So a minimum wage, it increases the wage that players that you could do it like a minimum wage in sporting league, but if we have a minimum wage for workers, that's going to benefit them. They're the producers. Sure enough, producer surplus goes up. A higher wage is going to be a bad thing for companies or the consumers of labor, so we would see consumer surplus would go down. Okay. Now, what did we also create? We created deadweight loss, right? And, you know, it sounds good, a minimum wage. So this is like the quantity of workers after the minimum wage. But what did we do? What would this represent? So this was the number of workers before the minimum wage. This is the number of workers after. This is like the loss of jobs, right? This might be some unemployment. So the minimum wage, if it is effective, yes, if you keep your job, if you're one of the producers of labor, one of the workers that keeps your job, you're better off. The problem is it also reduces the quantity in the market. So if you're one of these workers, what happened to you? Your surplus went to zero, right? You're no longer, you don't have a job anymore. So these minimum wages, although they sound good in practice, this they benefit people who keep their job, they might limit the number of jobs that are actually out there. Okay. So, to be fair, it looks like minimum wages would be a bad thing. Right? In some context, we could create some unemployment. There is an argument in terms of efficiency wages where, let's say I have a labor market, wage, supply, demand for labor, supply for labor, and let's say here is my minimum wage, right? So initially, when I impose this, it's going to look like it causes some unemployment, right? But it's going to raise the wage for people to keep their job. However, let's think about it this way. If all of a sudden I'm getting paid more, instead of $5 an hour, I'm getting paid $10. If this in any way could create a what word am I looking for? So like, let's say that people, at these higher wages are willing to work more. Like, not, well, I shouldn't say work more. Uh, be more like attentive at their job. Like they become more focused. They actually become a higher quality worker, right? Well, if this minimum wage, my workers don't hate me now because they don't feel like I'm paying them pennies on the dollar. What might they actually do if they work harder and become more productive? Well, what is the demand for labor? That's the marginal benefit to those companies. If the workers are now more productive, what would happen to their marginal benefit? At every wage, it would increase. So it would actually be like an increase in demand. So what could happen, and this is a rosy kind of view of it, but let's say being paid this higher minimum wage, your workers are more excited about their job. They're more effective when they're there. You get a more effective worker. The marginal benefit to you as a company is going up. Your demand curve increases. It could push it so that that minimum wage actually ends up being the wage that you're willing to pay them, right? It made your workers more productive. And now that minimum wage has kind of changed that equilibrium so that the new equilibrium wage is the same as the minimum wage. We now have more workers than we did before. And so this would be an argument why minimum wages might not create unemployment, right? Because if workers feel more valued and then become more productive as a result, potentially you see increases in demand. Another argument would be if you if you raise the wage and people are wanting to, there's more of a competition for jobs. Maybe they go out and get higher to, become more educated. That would increase their marginal benefit to the companies as well. And then you could kind of see that same demand shift, or that same increase in demand. That would help alleviate any of those concerns that the minimum wage might create unemployment. So that's probably taking it a little bit further than I would ask you a question about, seeing a demand shift. I'm just trying to use some of what we've talked about before, apply it to what we're thinking about today, to give a little bit more of like a real world context. Okay. So that's kind of the idea, right? Minimum wages, right? Unemployment everywhere. But if we have efficiency wages, right? One of the proponents could be our workers might then be more likely to get training, seek out additional programs, become higher quality workers, which would then increase that demand curve, and kind of push that minimum wage, push the equilibrium up to that minimum wage anyways. Okay. So that was kind of that efficiency wage. If we had time, I had in there. Okay. All right. Any questions before we keep moving here? Got 2 minutes left. So we'll save this for tomorrow. Taxes, subsidies. We'll go through quotas. That'll take us all 5 minutes. But I will, as soon as I get back to my office here, once I pack up, I will delete this old quiz, post a new one. So even if you submitted answers to this quiz while you were currently in class, you'll have to get back on and resubmit them. It's just a way for me to guarantee that if anyone had any issues with the lockdown in Zoom, that everyone's able to get on and kind of get those answers recorded. Okay. All right. Any questions for me before I end this recording? So what do you have to do before tomorrow? If you haven't already, that module 6 reading due before we start class. You can also get that module 7 reading done. That doesn't have to be due or done until we start class on Wednesday. Okay. All right.